Good day, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Conversations. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour this week. We've been talking about the Gospel of Luke for the last couple of months, actually. And because it's Thanksgiving, I felt like we ought to talk about that some this week and maybe encourage some conversation around your dinner table on Thursday. First of all, let me just start out by saying Thanksgiving to me is kind of a unique holiday. You know, we don't exchange gifts. We don't have any parties like we're just kind of, doing a lot of drinking or carrying on and stuff like we do in some other celebrations. It's just a turkey dinner with family. Maybe even a little football on that day, which wasn't part of the original celebration, of course, but we've made it kind of traditional to do that. I think the whole celebration and the whole notion of giving thanks kind of begs for a God component here. We can thank our lucky stars or Mother Earth or some other inanimate object for the things that have been done to us and for us. But I don't think we can really expect that something that can't receive gratitude, we really can't thank it, can we? We can thank a person or a being, but not an it. The personal God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of Jesus Christ. And I think he's the real reason for Thanksgiving. Think about two things that provide a source of gratitude toward him. The first one simply is God's provisions, and I see those as kind of an enduring source of gratitude, something that we just get all the time or just get in an enduring sort of way, as long as God's blessing us with those things, of course. And if you turn back to the Old Testament, into the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 through 18, in that particular passage, in that whole book actually, the people of Israel are about ready to go into the land of Canaan, a land that God is providing for them. And in verses 7 through 10 in there, Moses describes how that God is providing for them an abundance of natural resources for them to use and have and enjoy. As he goes on in that exhortation, he does warn them, however, not to take for granted God and the things or at least God, who is their true source of all of those things. And he tells them, sometimes fullness of all of those provisions and satisfaction with having all those things sometimes can lead to forgetting where those blessings truly came from. Moving a little farther along in the history of Israel, we get to Psalm 95, in particular verses 1 through 6. And we note in there, in verse 2, that coming into God's presence with thanksgiving appears to be a kind of well-established form of worship. The psalmist is calling them to come to God with thanksgiving. It says in verse 3 that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is above all other gods. In the Old Testament sense, he's not recognizing that there are truly other gods, but he's just saying that whatever other gods they are perceived to be, God's above all of them. And he tells them to remember that. In verses 4 and 5, he goes on to say that God possesses all of creation and of creation's resources. They're all in his hand. And of course, verse 6, worship is thus the natural response to all of those things. So I think when we are thankful on this Thanksgiving Day, I think we can justifiably thank God for our very existence and for the provisions that come from his hands. You may want to remember also that when you get into the New Testament, in the Lord's Prayer, we are told to pray for our daily bread. Even though Jesus says God knows we need those things, he still says you should pray for those things. I tend to think that one of the reasons Jesus tells us to do that is to remind us that we can be thankful for God's provisions for us. The other thing that I think can be a source of thanksgiving on this day is what I simply like to call God's surprising gifts. They're not so much new to God, but they can be new to us, and they surprise us and perhaps evoke that feeling of gratitude toward us. Earlier on in the Gospel of Luke, as we've been studying that, we learned in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19, that Jesus encountered 10 lepers. And he heals every one of them. He sends them on their way. But one leper, when he realizes that he's been healed, he's, I think, kind of shocked. And so he comes back to give thanks. I think it was one of those surprising gifts, very much a surprising gift in his, or for his sake, of course, a surprising gift of healing. And he was so stunned by it that he had to come back and give thanks. And I think there are some ways that sometimes we get those unexpected graces from God. Like perhaps when we first discover the realization that God does love us. You know, we're told in John 3:16 that God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son to die for us. When we realize that, it's like, oh man, that kind of really kind of touches me to hear that. Or perhaps when we see Jesus demonstrate compassion for the sinners, both in the Gospel of Luke and other Gospels. It's kind of a surprising fact that God cared enough and Jesus cared enough to spend his time with people that other people didn't think were worthy of his time. What unexpected moments of grace inspire you with gratitude? Maybe it's even something that somebody else does for you. Obviously, family members, you're grateful for those people and for the things that they do for you. In another passage in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 11 through 15, Paul is encouraging the church there in Corinth to continue the process that they started earlier in collecting some money for the poor. And in that particular passage, he's not only encouraging them to continue on with that process and make good on their promise to do that, or make good on their preparations to continue to do that, but he tells them, you know, if you do this, the generosity that you have will result in others giving thanks for your generosity. And that's sometimes what happens to us, isn't it? We're grateful when we see people being generous, or they're kind, or they're compassionate. And it can inspire us either with gratitude or inspire us to do the same thing. It's sort of a passing it along kind of thing, passing along the good things. But I want you to notice also verse 15 there in that passage, because Paul says in the long run, we can trace that all the way back to God and the inspiration that he gives for his own generosity in so many different ways. And so on this Thanksgiving Day, let's not only be thankful on this day, but learn to be always thankful for God's enduring provisions, for unexpected graces, and even for the goodness of others. Have some conversation around your table on this Thanksgiving Day for the things that you're thankful for. I look forward to seeing you next week and hope you have a really great Thanksgiving with your family.